Have you ever dared someone to do something unusual? Maybe it seemed bold, but not really dangerous. Well, today you'll hear a story set on Halloween 100 years ago, when a couple of kids dare each other to deliver a treat to someone who lives in the deep, dark woods. This story is from Gatineau student writer Olivia Beauchamp. Pull up a chair around the campfire and listen in to the Duskmire Forest. He went into the cavern, and boo! There in front of him stood a 10-foot Caleb. "Don't scare the children," said Lisa. Lisa didn't like scary stories, and she was sure that the kindergartners wouldn't like them either. "You're no fun," Caleb said, as he walked away from school. "You kids head on home," Lisa told the little kids, "and no more scary stories." It was October 30th, 1921, the day before Halloween. The little town of Aurora took Halloween very seriously, a little too seriously for Lisa's taste. Lisa tucked her long brown hair behind her ears and took a deep breath. She wasn't as big a fan of Halloween as everybody else. She didn't like scary costumes, or scary plays, or even the thought of being frightened. The only thing she liked about Halloween was the pumpkins, and she only liked those because she made the best pumpkin pie in all of Aurora. Walking away from school, Lisa spotted Jared next to the library with his friends. Jared was a nice boy, and a cute one too, with light brown hair and bright green eyes. He walked toward her shyly and asked her how her day was going. Before Lisa could even answer, Chelsea shouted from the library doors, "Hi, Jared! Hi, Lisa!" and she ran up to them. Chelsea was in an unusually happy mood, Lisa thought. She must have found a new boy to play with. Chelsea was a tall blonde girl with the prettiest blue eyes. Usually the boys were lining up just to stand beside her. "Why are you in such a good mood, Chelsea?" asked Jared. "Oh, maybe because Caleb has taken a liking to me," Chelsea replied with a smile. Caleb popped up from behind them and shouted, "Boo!" Lisa jumped so high she practically touched the sky. "Don't scare me like that, Caleb," she shouted. Chelsea laughed and laughed. "Caleb, your jokes are never funny," Jared said. Chelsea and Caleb just laughed it off as they walked away together. "See you two tomorrow for tricks and treats," Caleb shouted. Lisa and Jared walked to school together on Halloween, each carrying a pumpkin pie that Lisa had baked for their class. Caleb and Chelsea rushed up to them. "Do you know who we just saw?" Chelsea said. "Mr. Torrey." Lisa and Jared exchanged confused glances. "Who's Mr. Torrey?" asked Jared. "Mr. Torrey is the veteran who survived the Spanish influenza," replied Chelsea. "Everyone says he's mad." "Some say the fever drove him mad," Caleb said. "Some say the war drove him mad. And some say he was always mad and those things just made him worse." He leaned close to Lisa and said, "I dare you to go to his house and give him a pie." Lisa looked down at her beautiful pumpkin pies. "These are for the class." "But you brought two," Caleb said. "One for class and one for Mr. Torrey. Or are you too scared?" He and Chelsea snickered. "If you're so fearless, Caleb," said Jared, "why don't you give Mr. Torrey a pie?" He held out the pie in his hands and added, "I dare you." Caleb tried to laugh it off. "Mr. Torrey lives in a rundown shack that everyone says is haunted. No way I'm going anywhere near there." Chelsea looked at Caleb in surprise. "I thought you were fearless." "I'll tell you what, let's all go," Caleb said. "I'll give him the pie, but we'll all go together. I mean, why not? It's Halloween." Lisa wasn't too fond of the idea, but Chelsea was eager, and Jared was willing, and Caleb finally convinced Lisa to do it too. "It's settled. Let's meet this afternoon," he said. Lisa, Chelsea, Caleb, and Jared walked through the Duskmire Forest on the edge of town, out toward the old house that Mr. Torrey lived in. The weather was turning sour, and it was getting dark, and the house was much farther than they'd thought. "Maybe we should turn back," Lisa suggested. Jared agreed. "I shouldn't have dared you, Caleb. Let's just go home." But Caleb and Chelsea were excited by this adventure. They giggled as they walked shoulder to shoulder. "Mr. Torrey's waiting for his pie," Chelsea said. "Unless you're too scared to deliver it," teased Caleb. "As a matter of fact, I am," replied Lisa. "I don't like these woods. I don't like the stories about Mr. Torrey, and I don't like how late it's getting." "Oh, fine then," Caleb said. "Chelsea and I will deliver the pie, and you two little scaredy cats can head back home." Tomorrow Chelsea and I will tell you all about how Mr. Tory shared his pie with us and said it was the best Halloween ever. As Jared and Lisa walked back to town, leaving the dark woods behind them, Jared asked, "Do you think we should have left them?" "There is no way in the world you're going to get me to go back into that forest to look for them," Lisa said stubbornly. Jared agreed. "Okay, fine. They'll be okay, right?" "Of course they will," Lisa fretted. "This whole thing was Caleb's idea. I'm sure he knows what he's doing." The next morning, Lisa and Jared waited for Caleb and Chelsea at school. But they never showed up. Jared tried to calm Lisa down. "Maybe they're sick," he said, "or their parents needed them to work on the farms today." But Jared knew something didn't feel right. Chelsea staying home to do work? On a farm? He tried not to worry Lisa, but he knew something was up. After school, Lisa and Jared went looking for their friends. They went to Chelsea's house first, then to Caleb's. Both sets of parents said they hadn't seen their kids since yesterday. "We've been worried sick," Chelsea's mother said. "It's probably just a Halloween prank," Jared said to reassure her. "What are we supposed to do?" asked Lisa when they left. "We have to go look for them," said Jared. And they headed into the Duskmire forest. As they walked deeper into the forest, the giant trees staring at them, casting shadows around them, Lisa felt uneasy. The forest gave her a bad feeling, like something watching her, following her, trapping her. She grabbed Jared's hand in hope that it would make her feel a little better, but no matter how hard she tried, her legs shook and her teeth chattered. Jared, on the other hand, was focused on finding his friends. "I should never have dared him," he said. Through the trees, just ahead, was Mr. Tory's dingy house. "Do you think anybody's home?" Lisa whispered. No lights were on, and the house looked abandoned. As they approached, the door swung open slowly. Lisa gasped. Right inside the entry, sitting on the floor untouched, was the pumpkin pie that she'd made. The pie that Chelsea and Caleb had brought here for Mr. Tory. Lisa picked it up in both hands. The cast iron pie plate was cold against her skin. "Hello? Anybody home? Mr. Tory?" yelled Jared, in hope that someone would hear. The only answer was a muffled grunting in the darkness. They walked inside the old house and found their friends tied up beside the fireplace. Lisa and Jared ran to untie them. Caleb and Chelsea squirmed frantically and grunted from beneath the rags that covered their mouths. Lisa saw a shadow of something in the corner of her eye, something coming up from behind them. "Jared!" she shouted. Jared turned around, and there before them stood Mr. Tory, a tall, bearded man with scraggly hair and wild eyes. He was holding a shovel in both hands, ready to hit Jared on the head with it. "Ah!" Lisa screamed. The old man swung the shovel downward. Quick as lightning, Jared jumped out of the way. Then Lisa hit Mr. Tory with the cast-iron pie plate as hard as she could. Mr. Tory fell to the ground. "Gosh, I hope I didn't kill him," Lisa said. Caleb and Chelsea squirmed and grunted frantically until Jared and Lisa untied them. Then they all rushed away out of the house and through the forest to notify the town. Everyone in town was worried sick about where they'd been. Chelsea and Caleb's parents burst into tears of relief when they saw their children alive. Once the kids explained what had happened, everyone followed the police to Mr. Tory's house in the woods. But when they got there, Mr. Tory was gone. "But I knocked him unconscious," Lisa said. "He should be here." But all that remained of the harrowing scene was Lisa's pumpkin pie upturned on the floor of the cold, dark house. To this day, town legend says that Mr. Tory still roams the Duskmire forest, awaiting the arrival of young friends, ready to get his revenge. Thank you, Olivia. Olivia Beauchamp is a grade 7 student. Olivia's parents say that she talks too much, so she channels all the details of what she has to say into her writing. Her advice to other young writers is, keep a youthful imagination. And now for our next student story.